All right, thank you for listening to this podcast. This episode of Literally is sponsored by Lexicon and Line. Case, tell us a little something about Lexicon and Line.
Lexicon and Line, it does three things. They are communications consultants. They teach professional business writing and speaking courses, and they are research and data evaluation experts.
And you can find everything about Lexicon and Line at lexicononline.com. Please give them a visit, and thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast, Lexicon and Line.
This is who I am now. A headless woman, a four-legged woman, an inside talker for the Bed of Nails act, sitting on the strong man as he lies on the nails. An inside talker for the contortionist act. This is my most important role. I'm now a moneymaker. My new world is full of boxes. The boxes I put my head inside, the semi's container we live inside. I run between acts as the show cycles through from first act to last act every 30 minutes, the same pattern of movement between my four acts, so that already by noon on opening day of being an inside performer, I could have shown up where and when I was needed almost automatically, my feet moving by themselves. I still don't have much in the way of actual skills to perform, not really, not like everyone else out here, but I know how to talk into a mic. I can look straight into an audience member's eyes and, with a smile, lie. When I am not talking into the mic, though, I present my body in various forms. These, for example, are the instructions for losing your head. Put on your hospital gown. Step quietly onto the rickety side stage and prepare to slide sideways into the chair. Try not to ruffle the curtains surrounding it. If you do ruffle the curtains, or even if you don't, a child or teenager or adult might pull the curtains away from the stage anyway, peering inside at you. She will catch you with your attached head right there, mid-slide into the illusion. I slide off my mom's brace, the sock beneath. She is sitting on the bed, knows now, with practice, to let the muscles on the left side of her body flare, then squeeze, and hold the bones of her whole body together. An ocean keeping a tree upright, afloat, way, way out. It is the last few days before I leave for the sideshow, before the lovers will sail off into the Atlantic. I unzip her vest, remove her glasses. There is much work to be done to keep up with the rush of life on the vertical plane, the y-axis. All the therapies, all the doctors working toward that y. My mom peers past my busy hands to my face. She wears a grimace, a furrow of concentration. She isn't wearing a helmet today, not anymore, even though beneath her shaggy gray hair, her skull has a ledge. The absence of bone creates a canyon over a quarter of her head, where, just below the skin's surface, her brain is firing and always still bleeding. Miss Olga Hess, the headless woman, is a miracle of modern science. When the curtain is opened and they look at you, the audience will see a full woman's body, arms and legs flailing, in a chair surrounded by plastic tubes that light up red and green and blue, sparkly. They'll see the chest and collarbone of a woman's body and then, apparently piercing the flesh, a metal pole where a head should be. You've entered into the world of box jumpers, women who run backstage between illusions, sliding their bodies into one box and then the other. Spider women, electric women, four-legged women. You're all body. You are part of a long tradition of women who have lost parts of themselves. You will be whole only when nobody is looking at you. My mom holds my shoulder with her one good arm as we lean down toward the bed. I shift her hips, lift the right leg onto the bed, hear the crinkle of her diaper, a word we never use in front of her short baby breaths, and a dog barking outside. Usually this is where I tuck her in, kiss her forehead, and leave. Lace up my running shoes, move as quickly as I can on foot down the shaded trees of my hometown, breathing hard, trying not to notice neighbors who want to talk about her prognosis. Or I close myself into the kitchen to do homework, grade papers, or hustle around the stove to prepare a meal, or walk slow circles in the bathroom and talk myself out of taking any of the painkillers singing their siren songs in their orange dresses. If someone is holding the curtain open who should not be holding the curtain open, politely ask her to close the curtain. Change your tone as the day wears on and you become more tired, as the fair goes on. Use the loudest mean whisper you can. Say, "Shut the curtain." Then use only your arm when you see a peeker, a fast, wide swipe across the air in front of you toward their body, a warning. And then, as you are into hour 14 of performing, month 4 of being on the road, say nothing at all. Kick hard and fast toward the body of the person staring at you. Try to avoid contact, but don't worry if you don't succeed. As you slide into the chair sideways, your body tipping low and back, there's a moment of vulnerability where you cannot yank the curtain shut or make contact because you're lying too far back. To get flat is dangerous. Instead of leaving, I lie down. I am tired. I hold open the covers and slide in beside her. Why this time? She turns to me, takes that one good hand and places it on my cheek. It is warm and dry and gentle. We've left the vertical plane where I hold her up and wipe her crack. We are horizontal people now, and somehow that shift has reorganized the nature of how and who we once were to each other. Her hand is on my cheek, my hair, is the move a mother makes to her child. She slides her fingers along my neck, runs them very softly through my hair. It has been too many years since I have felt this much tenderness, and I don't have a place for it anymore. That's the awful price of coping. The metal post, as big around as a flagpole, sticks down a foot from the wooden box you need to slide your head inside once you sit in the chair. Crane your neck around the pole. Do not hit your head or you'll make a noise. Scooch back against the chair and straighten your spine and stretch your neck all the way up inside the wooden box, mirrored on the outside, tight and hot on the inside. Drape the blanket across your lap to look like what a sick person should look like, and arch your back. Sit straight so the metal pole presses its angled tip against your breastbone into the freckled hollow between and just above your breasts. Press it hard enough so that this spot will, for the next 3 months, be a little bruised in service of the illusion. Hunch your shoulders forward to cover any space behind the box, and ready your arms to grasp out wild and blind once the curtain is pulled. Never reach your hands higher than your shoulders. Never try to touch your own headless head, or your hands may shine back in the mirror to the audience. And then what miracle will they believe in? Instead, spread your fingers wide and keep them low, parallel to the dirt, reaching for the earth, shaking and alive, very alive, trapped in this headless body, escaping into the greatness of your own illusion. We are 2 soft, horizontal bodies breathing. Other mothers and other daughters in the world and in time lie side by side and pass on the secrets of the universe. My mother's waved, soft gray hair falls across the missing chunks of her head. Does she think about what's gone or what remains? I want to reach my hand out and trace the edges of her missing skull, but I'm paralyzed. No, she is paralyzed. Half of her is struck still. With the other half, she's running her fingers through my hair. Tears are pouring out the corners of my eyes, and my hands are moving up to catch them, because we've been warned by all the specialty doctors that we may not cry in front of her, may not show her our sorrow for fear of killing her hope. Hope there is not a yellow jacket stuck inside the small wooden box your head must stay in for the duration of the act. Hope it is not 107 degrees, and hope you don't faint with your face in the heat box, your body under extra blankets and costumes. Hope you'll be able to regain your head after the curtain closes and you slide sideways out of the box. Hope you won't have to kick any strangers on the way out. Hope your shoes are where you left them and haven't fallen behind the stage. Hope your makeup hasn't melted completely off. Hope you're suffering enough to begin to understand the suffering of others. When you move between the worlds of head and no head, know that you must move parallel to the earth. You must change your plane, reinvent your orientation until in front of you is sky and below you is the black earth. And that is your passageway, sister, mother, box jumper. You are your own door into a world of a different kind. You X-axis, you flattened miracle.
confronting authors with real questions about the writing process, the difficult and disheartening publishing industry, and why anyone would choose to torture themselves in the world of writing. This is the Literally Podcast with your host, writer, runner, and the literary voice of Ogden, Utah, Case Johnston. Exposing literature, the authors, the business, the process. The Literally Podcast.
Thank you. I feel like out of all of the chapters you could read from, this chapter and that excerpt feels almost like a full poem. Does that make sense to you? It feels like your breaks within the prose are stanza breaks, and the rest are just in the entirety of it is it feels more like a lyrical poem in the middle of a memoir. It's beautifully done, and so I'm glad you read the entirety of it for our listeners. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for encouraging me to go on. I as I said in the beginning, I've actually never read that part out loud before, so it was kind of cool to connect back to it. It's been a long time.
Yeah, I'm sure. And no, it was a great piece, and we're glad to have the exclusive. This is Case Johnston. This is a Literally Podcast. We're broadcasting from my home in Ogden, Utah. Today we're talking to Tessa Fontaine, the author of The Electric Woman. Tessa Fontaine is the author of The Electric Woman, a memoir in death-defying acts, a New York Times editor's pick, a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers pick, an Amazon Editor's Best of the Month featured debut, and Amazon Best Books of 2018, and more. Tessa spent the 2013 season performing with the last American traveling circus sideshow, The World of Wonders. Essays about the sideshow won the 2016 AWP Intro Award in Nonfiction and have appeared in The Rumpus, Hayden's Ferry Review, Autry, and elsewhere. Other work can be found in Glamour, The Believer, Lit Hub, FSG's Works in Progress, Grave Nonfiction, The Normal School, the Seneca Review, Diagram, New Orleans Review, Pank, and Brevity. Raised outside San Francisco, Tessa got her MFA from the University of Alabama and is currently a doctoral student in creative writing at the University of Utah. She's received awards and fellowships from Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, the Taft Nicholson Center, Writing by Writers, Squaw Valley Community of Writers, and taught for the New York Times Summer Journeys, as well as founding a Salt Lake City Writers in the Schools program. She currently lives in South Carolina with her fella and a pup. Around the country, she has performed her one-woman plays in theaters ranging from New York to San Francisco. The scar on her cheek from a 2 a.m. whip act is slowly fading. Which is sad. We want those to stay around. That's a story forever. And going back to the reading, what Tessa just read, I think not only is it so poetic, and I'm glad that she finished it out because it would seem like a poem that was unfinished. I think it's a great glimpse into the memoir itself that is a mix of this journey that Tessa went on with the slideshow, as well as the journey she went on with losing her mom. If you haven't picked up the book, you should. I read it 3 months ago and have been waiting to talk to Tessa that long, and so I'm so glad that we can talk to her today. So my first question is, looking at this journey, can you give us, for those who haven't read the book, a glimpse into where it all began?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And thanks again so much for having me on here. Yeah, so the sideshow journey kind of began when I was actually going to school. I was getting an MFA at the University of Alabama, and I learned that there was this one town in Florida where sideshow performers went to retire and would go live in the off season. And I learned that it was like the only town that had a postal counter designed for little people, and that the town had changed its legislation to allow for like people to have elephants and tigers in their yard and knife throwing. And so I just kind of started learning these facts about this town that made it seem very much outside of what seemed real. It sort of had this mythology about it. And so I went down there and started just kind of snooping around and calling strangers and sort of pretending I was a journalist, which I was not and am not. But it turns out if you just say you are, people just let you kind of do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Great tip. And so, yeah, eventually just kind of met the owners of this sideshow. And it's the only sideshow, the only traditional sideshow that still operates in America. It's been going on for years and years. And they let me, see the show and ask them a bunch of questions. And I just, I kind of just became like a barnacle to them. Like I just kept hanging around and wanting to ask more questions. And so finally the boss was just like, if you want to understand what all this is about, why don't you just join us for a season? And so I said yes. And I think if this had happened at a different point in my life, I absolutely would have said no. I think it was very much had to do with, my mom had this massive stroke a few years before. And then kind of more than that, she had just gotten out of the hospital not very long before my stepdad decided to take her on this journey around the world. They had always wanted to go to Italy and had never been able to swing it financially or anything. And so, or just because life was always too busy. And so he decided, like, screw it. We're just going to go for it. And, she's probably going to die soon, so we might as well go die somewhere beautiful. And so, it's a lovely romantic idea, like if strangers are coming up with it, but it's really horrifying to have your family decide that.
Right.
And so, yeah, it felt like, this kind of invitation to quite literally run away with a circus sideshow kind of presented itself, and it sort of felt like the only possibility.
And then you went.
And then I went, I went, right.
And it paints a different picture than the world's greatest showman with the with the huge. I mean, and I love it about it. It's gritty. I mean, it's so gritty. This is such a gritty book all the way through, and I mean gritty in such a positive way, in a positive, authentic, way. It's delivered, and it shows that grittiness throughout the book.
I appreciate
it. Yeah. Sorry, go.
Oh no, it's funny that you bring up The Greatest Showman, because so I actually saw that pretty recently, and I feel like, we definitely have kind of a romanticized idea about the circus in general, culturally, and particularly about P.T. Barnum, who is really at the center of that movie as him being kind of like this, this like, sort of businessman, but also sort of this inventor of the showman who treated all people equally. And it's just basically like a Disney version of The Little Mermaid, right? When we know the tale of The Little Mermaid is actually pretty horrifying or something.
Really dark. Yeah.
Really dark. Yeah. And I think the same is definitely true for what life in the circus and sideshow is like, for sure.
Yeah. I had emailed Tessa earlier when I was reading the book about one chapter in particular, and that was chapter 4, The Dragon. And I was just in the middle of the book when I read that, and then I finished the book, and that chapter still stuck with me toward the very end, because it was a harsh chapter, but beautifully written. That was heartbreaking but beautiful at the same time, and good memoirists obviously do that really, really well. And it's a chapter about how, falling out between a daughter and a mom, and of course a daughter who looks back later on in life and sees herself in that scene and wishes she played that scene differently. Can you talk about that in the sense of, as a writer, being able to voice those honestly vulnerable parts of your memory on the page?
Yeah, sure. Those were definitely the hardest parts to write. And I actually never intended to write a memoir. And I didn't even think that this was a memoir, basically until my publisher was like, yeah, of course it's a memoir, you idiot. And so it was sort of a surprise to me that in order for this story to have all of the dimensions that I wanted it to have and hoped that it would have, that it would require really kind of excavating some of those incredibly deep and painful memories and experiences. And it also ended up being some of the most helpful things I've ever done, one of the most helpful things I've ever done. And so I think this about writing, like I think that writing is not, I think that the idea that writing is always therapeutic is a wrong idea for me. I don't think that writing is always therapeutic. I don't think it should always have to be therapeutic. I think there are a lot of different reasons that people write, and that's great.
Right.
I think sometimes it happens to be very helpful. And for me, I'm like a pretty mediocre talker. I'm like a pretty mediocre liver of my life in sort of an oral tradition.
Right.
But I have to write things down truly, genuinely to figure out what I think about something, what's the truth about the experience of something for me. And so in some ways, actually writing out a bunch of these early experiences with my mom, it was kind of the first time I was confronting them in a really deep way that, was both really, really difficult, but also totally necessary for me to kind of let go of a little bit of that stuff. And I think really this is one of the wonderful things that writing in general can do for us, which is that, anytime you're writing, you are in some way, usually you're trying to create a version of a rounded character.
Right.
And so that means that you're writing someone, with their good parts and also their flaws. And I found this happening when I was writing this book, which is I would write, a moment with someone and I would read it and think like, oh man, I really kind of like paint that person, like in not a very nice way. And that would force me to kind of reinvestigate why I thought that way about them, or what my culpability was in that moment. Or it just like, it caused me to have to reevaluate and figure out, like try to think about things from their point of view, or what was going on in their life at that moment. And so I think the same thing happened with my mom, where writing all of this out made me have to think about her as a whole person instead of as like the kind of young kid that was wounded. And so it had made me also kind of have to own up to a lot of stuff that I regretted. So it was really hard and totally necessary, I guess, in short.
No, yeah, that's did you find yourself going back and revising when you looked like if you read it the first time and you saw this person that you're like, oh, I kind of painted them kind of shitty. Did you find yourself going back and revising and within that deeper look, expanding the prose or giving more of your faults to balance it out?
Yeah, I did a little bit. Certainly I think actually in some ways almost the opposite happened, to be honest. And that is, I really like front loaded this pretty heavy with a lot of my faults, kind of like, here are all of the really bad things about me. And then I would make these kind of like vague allusions to painful things that had happened, like with my mom or something. And so my editor would get to those moments and be like, what are you talking about?
Right.
What is this like poetic, lyric, totally incomprehensible line where you're like referencing the years of sorrow? And so it was so helpful to have an outside person kind of be like, what are you actually trying to get at here, and what do you mean? And so that is, I think, one of the things that made me kind of have to go through the specifics of it. And in some ways, like kind of writing out some of these moments made them less painful, I think, like a hazy idea about something is so much more painful than the thing itself, like the experience itself. Once you get to the specifics of what happened, it kind of like releases you in some way. And I think that in writing nonfiction, that happens all the time, especially with personal nonfiction. So yeah, I think more the revision that happened that like tempered it down a little bit was like, there were just a couple moments with other sideshow performers where I had like gotten in tiffs with people and so especially one person. And so revising some of those scenes toward thinking like, actually, I need to have a little bit more compassion for this person and try to think through the ways in which their life has been totally difficult up to this point and how that might play into how I'm thinking about them.
Yeah, it comes across really, really well, and it's really crazy because you talk about how your process was with it, and as a reader, it's so smooth that you wouldn't be able to see. You can't see where you would have had to gone back and change things. Does that make sense?
It does, and also that's amazing.
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, good writers and good editors working together can do that. But I think when going back to the chapter 4 is kind of when that vulnerability really came to the front. And at that point was where, or the dragon chapter, that's where I was like, okay, I'm with Tessa. I'm going with the rest of this book, and I am in and I am ready to, and that's when that's the, you don't put it down part of reading a book. Mine came during that chapter where, okay, I'm not putting this book down until it's finished. And so it was really, really well done. There's one thing in this book, and I hope I'm the first one that asks you about this, because I really there was one line in this book, one discussion that has stuck with me too, and it was when you were talking to your dad, and he said that he always believed that him and your mom would end up together. To me, I sat on that page for a really long time, and I reread it, and I thought, that's a really powerful thing to say, or a thing to convey, that after all this time, he was just, in his brain, he thought they would just end up together. Did that strike? I mean, obviously it did, because it's in the book, but how did that strike you initially?
I mean, it was a really weird conversation. Like, you grow up with these parents who just hate each other in all of the ways. And so I think learning not only that there is love from the past, but that there's some idea of a future connection, like that was, it was totally shocking to me. And I think it was also a moment of, and I mean, all of us go through this in some version or another, right? This process of really separating from your parents and understanding them as, whole, flawed adults, right? This is something I think maybe some people go through when they're teenagers, some people in their 20s, some people maybe never do. But
I think my son's figuring it out at 7 already.
Oh, is he? Smart kid.
Dad's really flawed. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Well, good. He won't have a painful.
Yeah.
But I think it was a moment where I remember calling him and thinking, like, I can't wait to be comforted by this person, by this really sad and horrible thing that's happening to my mom. And it was this big surprise to me to think, like, oh, he's not going to comfort me. He is now dealing with heartbreak too. And that was, really hard and lonely at first. And then in some ways it felt like, I don't know, it felt sort of good to think, like, actually there are a lot of people who, really love her in very different ways and have over very different different periods of time. And we can sort of all have our own versions of that loss and grief and trying to figure out, how you think about a person. And especially, I mean, the situation with my mom was pretty unique in that she had these strokes and lost the ability to talk or walk, but she ended up staying alive for quite a while after that. And so it was sort of this in-between phase we were in for a really long time, where the person she had been was absolutely not there anymore. But she also was very much alive and required an incredible amount of care. And so it was a really extended version of sort of like a new person entering your life who, you love and you have a history with, but also none of your interactions resemble what they did before. So yeah, it was a complicated piece of the puzzle, but ultimately pretty great. And here's something actually. So my dad recently was like, oh yeah, I read the book, and that scene where you talk about me and your mom, that wasn't right. I was like, what? and this is like one of the perils of writing personal
Yes,
nonfiction
absolutely.
too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like
Mhm.
people have their own interpretations. And I did due diligence for a lot of this book and kind of cross-referencing my stories, but I didn't in that particular moment. And he was like, no, it was your mom that told me that she wanted to end up together smoking cigars one day. It wasn't my idea, it was her idea. That it had come from, that it had been sort of like, I don't know, I had just this idea that he was really kind of romantic and lonely for her, but actually maybe it was just a more complicated story than I had believed. So
Yeah, but he held on to it. You know what I mean, and told you about it, which says something. And but that's really, of course, that's the whole can of worms with nonfiction that we can't get into. I mean, we could, but maybe at AWP this year we'll have a drink. We'll talk about that.
That sounds good.
But and Brandon's heard that 100 times about what is truth and how do we do this, and we get it. And I and that scene, I think that scene too, I think it shows even something bigger than I love the romanticism in it, the wishful thinking. But I also think it talks to about how short time is. I think it's a really good kind of signifier of our lives are so short, and something that seems like with your mom and dad, I'm guessing, they were apart most of your life, and it seems like a long time to you, but probably to them, as we grow older, we feel like it was just yesterday, and they could end up with, smoking cigars and ending up together. It was powerful for me, and I think it was powerful for me just because it looks like, I swear, life goes by so fast, and it was a scene that just says, "Oh yeah, well, I know that all this stuff is past, but we could just still end up together." So it kind of blew my mind. I don't know. Like I said, I hope. I think about weird things with books, but that's the one. That's one of the ones that got me.
I'm very glad to know that.
Yeah,
and you are indeed the only person that's pointed that out.
I tell you, I sat on that page for because it's so real, and I was at that point, like I said, I was with you, and I was imagining just like I don't know how it would feel if I were her. This is the Literally Podcast. This is Case Johnston. Today we're talking with Tessa Fontaine, the author of The Electric Woman, that is doing really, really well. A book about a dual narrative about Tessa's time in a sideshow, traveling across the country, and at the same time losing her mom after a series of really serious strokes. We've talked a lot about the family aspect of your book so far, and that's partly my fault because with memoir, I really, those are the things that get me. But there's a whole other aspect to this book, and it's a large aspect. It's half of this book is your time traveling throughout the country, doing sideshow acts. And I wonder, do you ever dream of snakes? There's Brandon.
I do.
Yeah, I bet you do.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually have this, sometimes I think of it like a premonition, but it's actually just probably a fear. But I'm always sure that there's going to be a snake behind in the bathroom behind the toilet. I don't know why. Every time I walk into a bathroom, especially now, I live in the South. And so every time I walk into a bathroom, I'm like, oh boy, here we go, dealing with the snakes again. And near the toilet, and no snakes in my bathroom, but one day there's gonna be.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Well, and to let Brandon know, and to those listening, there are parts in the book where there are large snakes wrapped around Tessa's neck and body, and my mom would die. She couldn't read this book because she's so fearful of snakes but for those who haven't read it, can you tell us about some of the most telling parts of being on the sideshow? And that doesn't necessarily have to be the death-defying acts, but they can be the underbelly of it, or something that's, because it's been it's been 5 years now. Has it been 5 years?
Yeah, 5 years. Yeah.
What are the things obviously when you're there, you're thinking, okay, I'll remember this snake around my head forever. But what are the things that you do remember the most when you think about that time?
Yeah, interestingly, I guess it isn't the acts themselves, I think, that feel the most emblematic of the sideshow. And I think that the acts, so we performed a grind show, which means that you perform the same show over and over again from the time the carnival opens, which is maybe 9 a.m., until the time the carnival closes, which is maybe midnight. So you're performing, maybe 15 hours a day, act to act, back to back, without taking any breaks. And so it becomes, in some ways, like it's both really dangerous what you're doing, like you're swallowing swords and eating fire, and you have snakes around your body, you're throwing knives,
Right.
sitting on an electric chair, but it's also like totally boring because you're doing each of those things 30, 40, 50 times a day, maybe more. And so it's a really bizarre mix of I think, like at totally spacing out, not paying attention to what you're doing, and also knowing that at any moment you could kill yourself very easily.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think about that, about the monotony of it. But I think the thing that really kind of, when I think about my time there, the thing that was actually the hardest, it was not those acts. Those acts became, just very second nature. But all of us performers lived in the back of a semi truck, like in the container of a semi truck together. We didn't have, rooms with doors. There was no plumbing, no water or bathrooms or anything. And we were just in a super contained space that was open to the elements, because the sides of it were open, for one side folded down into our stage. And the back end was usually open as well. And so, I've never just been so physically close to a group of people all the time. And that part was probably the hardest, not having any privacy or any moment to like just be alone for a second, or, if you even wanted to, talk to someone on the phone, like way late at night once the fair was over, and you would have to walk way down somewhere into Carneyland to try to, have a moment of privacy or whatever. So I think just what it was like to just be in the constraints of that world, that's what I think about still. Like days when I wake up and I'm grumpy, but I'm like, oh, but I could walk into my kitchen and cook some eggs and close the door.
Right.
Like, this is living large.
Yeah. There's nobody, passed out right next to me, snoring and gross. Yeah. And the book does that so well. I mean, there are a few chapters that are the day in the life chapters. I think the one where you're talking to your brother, when he's like, how's your day? And you're like, I could tell him all these things, but I'm going to tell him it's just fine, because it was a really nice chapter that went through not only the monotony of the day or how it can become monotonous, but the continued movement of the day, that you're up early, you're moving this, and so those who are interested, it's a great view into what it's like to be on the road with people, and doing these things, and the type of people that choose to do these things. And it was enlightening and fun, and it's a book that I suggest that everybody pick up. I really do. And so looking at that day-to-day stuff, was there any time where you felt like, I'm just gonna go, I'm just done?
Every day.
Okay.
Every day.
Right,
Yeah, without fail, every day. And there were plenty of days where I would look up plane flights or bus, nearest bus station, nearest airport, plane flight out of there. I thought about it all the time. But there was this piece of me that felt like, I just felt like, if my mom can do what she's doing and going through right now in all of this physical therapy and in the amount of pain that she's in, essentially being stuck inside a body and a mind that no longer really work. Like, if she's doing that, I can survive a few months out here on the road. And so I really, I just couldn't bring myself to give up. I think the idea of giving up on the sideshow somehow got conflated in my mind with the idea of giving up on her, or giving up on how hard she was working or something. And so I couldn't do it. I felt like I just had to stick it out. And oh man, sometimes it was brutal. Sometimes it was really brutal, and I wanted to leave pretty badly. But ultimately, I mean, I think it would have been one of those things I also would have regretted for forever had I not stuck it out.
Yeah. And the interesting part about it is your mom was traveling for a good portion of the time too, correct?
Right. Yeah. So they did leave on that long delayed journey to Italy that they always wanted to take. They went on it, and she didn't have a bone plate in her head anymore because of her brain just was always bleeding, and so she couldn't go on an airplane. So they took a boat. They took a train from California to New York, and then a boat from New York over to Italy, and they were traveling the same time that I was on the road. And so I didn't actually get to talk to them very much because they were, in the middle of the ocean or too busy, like cruising the streets of Rome. And so, that was also a really kind of strange experience to have to let go a little bit of the amount of kind of obsessive, just checking in I had been doing, for so long. And just kind of knowing like, there's this chance that they were very honest about that they're not going to come back, and somehow I have to sort of like find some semblance of peace with that, which I don't know that I ever totally did, but I sure tried, or at least was too busy eating fire to get to spend a lot of time thinking about. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, it's a telling book about both of these things. There are two journeys going on, and my last question always is is there anything that you would want to tell people about the book that I haven't asked or we haven't discussed yet that you want them to know about either the journey of being in the sideshow or with your mom, that you'd want people to know while they read it? I
don't know exactly about while they read it, but I think one thing that I sort of found to be incredibly true. And it's something that I try to think about a lot because I think it still is something that I need to be reminded of all the time. Like I go to these events, I go to a book reading or a literary festival or something, and I encounter people who have read the book, which is so wonderful. And they're like, oh, you must not be afraid of anything. I'm like, please, I am still afraid of so many things, and so I think about this though, that I have to remind myself that it's fine to be afraid, and it's fine to be unsure about something, but that also doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that thing. And so, like, many times I think fear is a good guide for us to sort of help us decide what to do and what not to do, and then sometimes it's really an unhelpful guide, and like there's no reason that I should have been okay like sitting on an electric chair, and there's also no reason that I should have been okay sort of letting my mom go in this incredibly slow way. But I think even more than letting her go, figuring out how to be okay with the fact that we had a really hard and difficult relationship. And so there was sort of no easy path, and there was no, big tearful conversation where we like found some peace. It was just a matter of kind of going into the nastiness and being afraid of it and having it be painful. And then that was just what it was. So I don't know, I guess I would be, delighted for anyone to read it. And I know that everybody has a version of this in their life, a thing that they are, or many things that they are afraid of and that are painful, and that in some ways, you just know that it's still a thing you have to do. And so I hear you and I see you, and we all sort of just have to walk through that fire, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to end this. Thank you so much. It's been so nice to talk to you finally, and I've been really excited about it. So I've just been kind of excited to talk about the book, and I want to thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Case. I really appreciate being on here and your thoughtful questions, and I'm glad that it worked out. It's great to get to talk to you.
This is Case Johnson. This is the Literally Podcast. We've just spoken with Tessa Fontaine, the author of The Electric Woman. You can get it anywhere, but I prefer you order it through your local independent bookstore. Ours is booked on 25th. And I hope that you'll pick it up and check it out.